International Ground Rounds. Today is a very special meeting and ground rounds in regards to a new topic, which is going to be very exciting for me. It's going to be on ivermectin in COVID-19, and the special guest today is Pierre Kory, which is an associate professor of medicine. It's part of the St. Luke's Aurora Medical Center, and in fact is also one of the member from the Frontline COVID-19 Clinical Care Alliance. Good morning, Pierre.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So for those who don't know, the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance is based on different and multiple specialists around the world. The main field is based after the Math Plus protocol. For those who don't know, it's a protocol that has been made from Paul, Marik, Pierre, and the team from the Frontline COVID Critical Care Alliance. And then it has been hugely spread this word in regards to the Math Plus. And I'm very excited because I was lucky to be involved in this as an associate, and I'm part of from Italy, and I really believe that the Math Plus is one of the most interesting and very well defined protocol for the treatment of the patient, for the moderate, severe, and critical ill patients suffering from COVID-19. And recently, this protocol has been readopted because initially it was also developed for prophylaxis and early stages, but then suddenly it has been changed and this protocol has been readopted, and now the title and the name of this is eye mask. And Pierre today, he's going briefly to talk about the eye mask, but mainly in regard to ivermectin in COVID-19, and he's going to talk about a review. He made a huge review of the evidence base supporting the widespread use of ivermectin in the prophylaxis and treatment of COVID-19. So I will leave the torch to Pierre. He's going to share his screen and some slides so you will be able to understand what's the science behind ivermectin and why it could be potentially a great choice when we're dealing with COVID-19. So for everyone attending, please do remind for the questions you will be, if you are tuning from Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, you are able to type your question and we are going to reply on that at the end of Pierre talk. Please, Pierre, share your screen.
Puya, thank you for that introduction. And it's just been great working with you. You are an ally and a partner of ours. And I think we think alike. And if you're like us in this group, since this pandemic started, this is all we do 24/7 is we trying to figure out how to end this thing. And so we do think that there's a solution, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. And I'm really glad you invited me. So let me share my screen and I'll get to my slides. Here we go. And then I'm going to go play first. How does that look? Okay.
It's great, but if you can switch, now we have the presentation in mode. Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's go. All right. So I'm going to talk about ivermectin and oh boy, the evidence for ivermectin and what it's proving to show, which is we're getting the signals now that this thing could be, and I know this word is overused, but we use it in the States. We call it a game changer, and this really is what we think is going to be a game changer. So let's talk about why we think that is. So number one, as Dr. Dehgani introduced, I'm part of a group led by Paul Marik, and we can't say enough about Paul, but when the pandemic started, Paul's a critical care doctor, and when the ICUs around the world were starting to fill and overflow and the mortality rates were just indescribable, Paul reached out to his close network of colleagues, which I'm very fortunate to be one. I'm very close with Paul. We talk medicine constantly. We're probably on the phone 5 times a day. And he also has another network. And so you'll see it's all a bunch of white men. There's no women there yet, but we'll get get one. But we also were brought together by Keith Berkowitz, Howard Kornfeld, Fred Wagschul, and then we also have some international clinical advisors that work with us. And all we do is talk COVID. We read papers constantly. We're constantly sharing new information and insights. And we've been totally devoted to trying to figure out how to treat this disease and limit the morbidity and mortality. That is what we do. So today, I want to talk about where we are and where I think we can go. I think this is a very positive talk. In fact, there's been nothing positive we could say so far. Everything has been either just disappointing or just not helpful. And there's so much misery in the world right now, but I think there's a way out. And let's talk about why I think that is. So today I want to go through where we are with this pandemic. It's not good, right? Let's talk about where we are with the therapeutics. We don't really have that much. I will say that our Math Plus protocol for hospital is quite good. It's quite effective, especially if you know how to use it and titrate those medicines accordingly. However, it's not keeping people out of the hospital. Hospitals are still filling, case counts are going up. And so we need to talk about maybe a potential early treatment solution. And I want to go over ivermectin. I'm going to go over the history and safety, and then we're going to review all of the existing and emerging clinical evidence for its use and its role. And it's proven to be a highly potent therapy. And I'll show you just how potent in a moment. So first of all, I have no disclosures. Second of all, on no slide in this talk did I put a reference. I just didn't have the time. But the manuscript that I wrote in this past week that I shared with you, Dr. Dehgani, is posted now on a preprint server. Everything that I'm going to say in this talk is very well detailed in that manuscript. And so that's available on a preprint server. So if anyone wants to read it or share it, I welcome you to do that. And it can be located at that website address. So where are we? Well, just this morning, I looked out at the world and this is what I saw. So in the Washington Post today, the headline is COVID hell. It shows a drastically escalating number of cases. The hospitals are filling. I happen to live in the state of Wisconsin, which has had some of the highest numbers in the United States for weeks now. We are just we're failing to control this pandemic. I also looked at Google and look at Italy. Italy seems to be following what's happening here in Wisconsin. Look at those beautiful cases in June and July and September. You guys had it under control. Now, I think you were under lockdown during most of it, but now it's completely out of control. And so it seems that it seems like the social and behavioral interventions are failing to control this disease. And so I don't know how we're going to get better with that unless we go into another lockdown. And we all know what everyone feels about another lockdown. So the other depressing thing is, where are we with therapeutics? Every therapeutic almost is failing. Now, corticosteroids is the one thing for the moderate to severely ill. We've known that since way before the recovery trial. It's been part of our Math Plus protocol since March or April. But all the other things that have been tried is just, they're just not helping. Hydroxychloroquine, the randomized controlled trials are uniformly negative. The observational controlled trials are a little bit all over the place. There's so many people who still believe that hydroxychloroquine is effective. I don't think that's the case. I'm very underwhelmed with the data, even the observational data, even recognizing that observational data is quite good. You don't need or have to rely on randomized controlled trials. They generally are equivalent on average in history. But when one side aligns on one side, like the RCTs are all on the negative side and the OCTs, the observational control trials, are on the other, you have to wonder what's going on there. There has to be some sort of bias, or maybe hydroxychloroquine is only good early. And I am part of a group that is now looking at data from the post-exposure prophylaxis trials, which is actually finding a signal for hydroxychloroquine in preventing infection, but you have to take it very early after exposure. But outside of that data, I'm very underwhelmed with hydroxychloroquine as a therapeutic. We know now that convalescent plasma has failed. Remdesivir has failed. Even though it's being used widely at $3,000 a dose, everybody thinks it's the savior. It is not. All of the clinical trials that were not sponsored by the drug company who made the drug appear to be profoundly negative. lopinavir, interferon beta. They're all failing. And so if you look at this was compiled by Dr. Marik. And this is actually what led to this talk, because in Dr. Marik, when he was reviewing all of the recent studies and the Solidarity trial, and he was looking at all of this, the negative results of all the trials, you know, ivermectin was on this list, and we always had it, and Paul always had it with a question mark. And when he was reviewing all this data, he started to look at the emerging data on ivermectin, and he said, wait, maybe there's a signal here. But before we get to ivermectin, look at everything that's failed. The only thing we have is corticosteroids once you're in the hospital and your lungs are sick. We know that's life-saving. We know this is a steroid-responsive disease. However, it's not going to prevent you from getting the illness. It's not going to prevent you from going to the hospital. It's not going to prevent people from filling ICUs. I would like to say one thing is it is my personal and professional opinion that the recovery trial, although it did a lot to save the world, is also hurting this pandemic. And I'll tell you why. The dose in the recovery trial is almost completely insufficient. It saves some, but it fails many. You cannot give someone 6 milligrams of dexamethasone in this illness and expect them to get better. Some will, the most won't. We need higher doses. We're learning that more and more and more. I'm starting to use very high doses in the ICU. I think in the wards and in the hospital, people need to be more aggressive. This is a steroid-responsive disease. The recovery trial used a very low and modest dose, yet the entire world is following the recovery trial. I'm asking everyone, please be a doctor. Think clinically. There's no tablet that came from the mountain that said, thou shalt have 6 milligrams of dexamethasone and be cured. 6 milligrams is an anemic dose. I'm a lung specialist as well. I give way more steroids to my outpatient elderly COPD patients. 6 milligrams of dexamethasone in a critically ill or even moderately ill patient is not enough. So I just want to say that. But it is effective. We know it's effective, and we are using it. And I think that's really, really helpful. What's not on this list is anticoagulation. I think more and more doctors are recognizing that the more aggressive you are with anticoagulation, the better patients do. So those are the really two therapeutics that I think really work. Now, Dr. Dehgani introduced us and our Math Plus hospital treatment protocol, which we're very proud of. We know it works. We've been doing very well with that. A manuscript actually was accepted. It passed peer review. It's about to be published. And it's a very long manuscript. In fact, it's 10,000 words, and it goes through all of the data and published evidence in support of each of these components. So Math Plus is methylprednisolone, ascorbic acid, thiamine, heparin, and some co-interventions, which we know are helpful. And so when we see patients in the hospital, we tend to use the entire protocol. Some people use different parts, but the core components are the same. Please note that ivermectin is now on this protocol, and you'll understand why that is at the end of this talk. So we just talked about some of the failed therapeutics. It's all been in the hospital. But has anyone thought of early pre-hospital treatment? There's a guy on this slide that I recognize. He looks very familiar. It's Dr. Dehgani-Mobaraki. And that's how our group and he first linked up. Obviously, he, like anyone else, was completely motivated to try to do something. His work has been published. He's made a big impact in this disease. And he recognized that early treatment, like all of us who doctor, we know anytime you get ill, in order to intervene, it has to be early. And his protocol, which he put together, which was similar to ours, and that's how we linked up. We realized that we were two birds of a feather, or we were of the same mind. He came up with his Protocollo D. How's my Italian accent, Puya? Protocollo D. And, it has a lot of the same elements and interventions. They just make sense. They're safe, they're cheap, and we know that they have physiologic basis. And in fact, as we go on, more and more data comes out to suggest that they are actually critically helpful. In fact, 2 days ago, there was a study that came out that showed that patients on vitamin D supplements do better. if you take vitamin D supplements, you will do better with COVID. And so we've known this, and we've tried to recommend this for a long time. And if you read the Math Plus paper, which is going to come out, it'll show you all the rationale for all of these elements. But Dr. Dehgani's protocol is very similar to ours. And so Paul Marik, who's the leader of our group, he has long also gotten interested in early treatment. Ourselves as a group, we are intensive care doctors. We first really focused on how to treat patients who are sick in the hospital. But Dr. Marik has always tried to put out advice to prevent people from coming to the hospital. And we appreciate his efforts. And this was one of his earlier protocols, which really mirrors very much Dr. Dehgani's, right? So it's quercetin and zinc and vitamin C and vitamin D, but please note it now includes ivermectin, right? As well as aspirin, which we now are appreciating how critically important aspirin is. But now let's change gears and let's talk about ivermectin, because it's just at the 11th hour when all seems so, I don't know, when we're so much in despair and we're actually suffering and nobody knows the solution. I need you to listen carefully, because this talk is going to try to support what could be a global solution. Okay, number one, ivermectin. What is it? Where did it come from? And why are we talking about it today? So number one, it was discovered in 1975 by a Japanese gentleman named Satoshi Omura, and an American who worked for Merck, William Campbell. And it's a compound produced by this bacteria Streptomyces. And what they found was it was highly effective against parasites. So it's used for onchocerciasis, strongyloidiasis. And in fact, since it started to be used and it showed such high degrees of effectiveness against these parasites, it is ubiquitously used across much of the world where parasitic infection is endemic. So Africa, South America, and India. And to date, 3.7 billion doses have been distributed. And when you read about the history of ivermectin and what it's done for the world, especially the poor and middle income world, is it's decreased morbidity and mortality, especially in areas where the disease river blindness was extremely endemic. There were populations and societies in Africa where half of the men in the population were blind by the age of 40. From onchocerciasis, which is the river blindness disease. After the introduction of ivermectin, it has preserved eyesight and led to drastic reductions in blindness in those areas. And so it's had such profound effect in the history of medicine that it was actually awarded the Nobel Prize in 2015 for the two gentlemen who helped discover it. And it's now on the WHO's list of essential medicine. So it's long been an important medicine on a global scale. And I think it will be again. So is it safe? Let's just talk about it. And 3.7 billion doses have been distributed. There are almost no severe reactions. Well, I shouldn't say almost no, but the side effects, it's so well tolerated. In fact, the majority of the side effects are generally attributed to the disease that it's treating, that when you kill all the worms and parasites, you get a little bit of an inflammatory reaction. So you might itch, you might have a fever, you might get a rash, but it's not the drug. It's not thought to be due to the drug. It's extremely well tolerated. There have been some rare severe neurologic events, but that's also thought largely due to the disease that it's treating, which is like loa, which can involve the brain. So it's extremely safe, extremely cheap, and has a long history of use. So that's number one. Now, why are we talking about it in COVID-19? It's a parasite medication. Well, here's the thing. Over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of in vitro studies, which is like showing when they're in the lab and they do these different virus models, they're showing that when you expose cell cultures to ivermectin, they're seeing that the replication and propagation and entry of those viruses into cells are greatly inhibited. And so much so that early on in the pandemic, a group of researchers in Australia said, hey, I wonder if ivermectin works against SARS-CoV-2. And their paper was, it was broadcast all across the world. Everybody was impressed with their paper. And what they showed is when they infected cell cultures with SARS-CoV-2, and they looked at the viral replication. They noticed after exposure that it led to absence of nearly all viral material by 48 hours. This is the study by Cayley et al. And in the lab, I think it's Kylie Wagstaff. And they got a lot of attention for this paper because it really showed this dramatic, laboratory observed absence of virus after you expose it to exposure. Now, we all know that many, many, many things work in test tubes. But, like I said, the title of this talk is For Bench to Bedside. There's so many things that can work in a lab, but does not work in a human model in the patient when you give it by mouth. Okay. So to say that because they showed this dramatic impact in the lab that it's going to work in humans, that's a stretch then. Okay. But let's talk about the literature that's come out since. So since then, more people and researchers have paid attention to ivermectin, and the data just keeps accumulating. So the basic science data, it shows that interestingly and fortuitously and even miraculously, ivermectin can bind to the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. So it can actually interfere with its attachment to the ACE2 receptor and actually can prevent entry. It also messes with a lot of the formation of proteins that the virus uses to replicate and divide, and as well as the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. We know how important those are for replication and for reproducing the RNA. And not only that, let's move now out of the test tube, out of the lab. Recently, an animal model was published, a study on an animal model. It was interesting. They didn't use SARS-CoV-2, but they used a coronavirus that's very similar to it. And it's called mouse hepatitis virus. And they infected a whole bunch of mice. And half the group, they didn't give ivermectin. The other half of the group, they gave ivermectin. And what they found was in the group that did not get ivermectin, the mouse hepatitis virus destroyed the livers of all of these mice. They actually euthanized all of the mice and then examined all their livers. And if you didn't get ivermectin, the livers showed severe inflammation and necrosis if you didn't get treated with ivermectin. But the mice that got treated actually showed largely preserved livers. In fact, they were not significantly different than the control mice who did not get infected. And so it was a pretty profound animal study. Okay. We're not mice, so let's keep going. So before we go into some of the clinical data, so based on the fact that it has this theoretical in vitro ability to limit viral replication, it messes with so much of the machinery and processes that the virus uses to replicate and cause disease, it would be reasonable to ask, could it be helpful at preventing illness onset? Could it actually kill the virus as soon as you get exposed to it so you don't get sick, right? So researchers around the world have started, and we now have data from 3 trials. 2 of them are randomized, and I just want to show you, I had the central features of these trials. Okay, so number 1, large randomized controlled trial from Egypt, large randomized controlled trial from Argentina, and this was an observational controlled trial from India. Let's go over Shalman from Egypt. What's interesting is the way they enrolled these people is that anybody who tested positive for COVID-19, they immediately identified who the family members were and put them all on ivermectin. They took 2 doses. Keep in mind, ivermectin has a very long half-life. In fact, in almost all of the parasitic diseases, 1 dose is all that's necessary. 1 single dose. In this trial, they took 2 doses. And what they found was this overwhelmingly dramatic decrease in the percentage of household family members of someone with COVID who developed COVID symptoms, 7% versus 58%. It basically shows if you don't take ivermectin, you're almost assured of getting COVID. Whereas if you take ivermectin, very, very few will get sick with COVID. And so that was a profoundly positive trial. Now, here's the issue, and this is the issue with a lot of this talk, Dr. Dehgani, is that so much of the data it's what I'm calling emerging. This data is available on clinicaltrials.gov. It's not peer reviewed. It's not in a paper. It's not in a journal yet, but it's out there. We know what the results showed, and we have to trust in them. And so based on this signal, we were really moved by this. The other study, also on clinicaltrials.gov, not published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it is available and you can see it. Again, here they took healthy patients. They took 229 and they took half of them and they said, you know what? Take a drop of ivermectin 5 times a day and let's see how you do over 28 days. And what they showed was that if you did that, nobody got sick. Whereas if you didn't do that, 11% of them got sick with COVID, positive COVID tests. And then Bihar in India, what they did is they looked at high-risk people, which is just healthcare workers, and they did a whole bunch of surveys and they looked at everyone. And basically they saw that if any, because everybody was prophylaxing, right? Everybody's been swallowing hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and this and that. And, you know, nobody wants to get sick. And when they found those that was taking ivermectin as prophylaxis had a far lower risk, 0.27, 27% of the chance of getting COVID as others who didn't take it. So you have 3 really profoundly positive trials showing that ivermectin is an effective prophylactic against COVID-19. So it suggests the possibility of what if everybody was taking ivermectin? Could we reduce these terrible case counts, the massive transmission, and the destruction to society and economic activity that we're all troubled by? We'll come back to that. The other set of studies that have come out. Now, we're moving from prophylaxis. Now we're going to go to early outpatients, so early treatment. Dr. Dehgani, that's where we are. This is where our heads have been. We don't want people to go to the hospital. Listen, if you get sick, you come to the hospital and you're dying, I know how to put you back together, but I don't want to have to do that, okay? And so we want to keep patients out of the hospital. So what does it look like when you use ivermectin in early treatment? And this is where it gets really interesting. So same guy who did the prophylaxis trial, they used a protocol in Argentina, and they reported on actually 2 sets of patients, but in their hospitalized, their outpatients, which is I think 135, they showed that only 1 died. So out of 32, so that's a 3% hospital mortality. Again, it's a small group, but it's only 1 patient died out of the 32 hospitalized. If you guys have noticed, the hospital mortality worldwide, and we've calculated this recently, Dr. Marik has been reviewing that. He did a spreadsheet where he reviewed data from 39 studies, 165,000 patients. The worldwide hospital mortality, this is as of the summer, was 23.9%. So again, it's a small sample there, but at least it's suggestive. Okay. Then there's an RCT that came out of Bangladesh, again, not published, available on clinicaltrials.gov. But when you look at that, in these outpatients, 363 outpatients who took ivermectin and doxycycline, they showed significantly higher rates of early improvement and significantly lower rates of deterioration. There was not a lot of mortality in that trial, but it definitely showed a statistically significant impact. And then Potter was a small study. They showed an almost significant reduction in time, but again, it was small, and again, they were all mildly ill. Alam, and then there's some case series. So Alam in Bangladesh reported on 100 patients, 100 in a row, all got better 72 hours. In RCT in Bangladesh, that was a little bit more interesting one. They showed us almost statistically significant reduction in recovery time, but it's large. I mean, 5 days versus 9 days till you're free of symptoms. And then Morgenstern in Dominican Republic, that's kind of an interesting trial. So they collected data on if you look over at the outcomes, they collected data on 2,688 consecutive outpatients treated in the emergency room. They all came to the emergency room with symptoms. And if they treated them with ivermectin, they found that there was only 1 death out of 2,688 patients, 0.03% mortality. And in the hospital patients outside of the ICU, 1% mortality in their hospitalized patients. Again, I told you before, it's 23% is the worldwide average. And then in the ICU, they showed, obviously, as we all know, the ICU mortalities are very high. There they had 30%. However, it makes sense that it would work as a prophylactic. It makes sense that it would work at early and preventing deterioration and resolving symptoms, right? Because those are what we call the viral replicative phases, right? And so we know it's a good antiviral, and it looks like the clinical data is supporting that it has potent antiviral activity. But what about in the hospitalized patients? Could it work there? Well, our first guess is that it shouldn't work there, right? Because we know that viral replication, by the time you get severe enough symptoms to be admitted to the hospital, study after study have shown you can't generally culture virus. Most of the autopsies do not show cytopathic changes from viral infection. Everybody's dying of this horrendous immune response to what we now know is the RNA fragments. The RNA of this virus seems to trigger this horrendous inflammatory reaction. So we're not dying of the virus. We're dying of the response of the presence of the virus. And so viral replication is really on the wane or actually non-existent or starting to become non-existent by the time you hit the hospital. So why would ivermectin work? Well, here's the other piece to the puzzle. It now appears that ivermectin, besides having antiviral activity, has anti-inflammatory effects. So a growing list of studies are showing that it significantly inhibits cytokine production in bacterial sepsis models from lipopolysaccharide exposure. It downregulates the transcription of NF-κB, which we all know is one of the most potent mediators of inflammation, and then also nitric oxide and prostaglandin. So the effects of ivermectin seem to have, it suggests that it could work as an anti-inflammatory as well. So in multiple phases of the disease. So has anyone studied it in the hospital? Yes, they have. Here we go. Hospital patients. So the one study that was published, it was an observation control trial where they did propensity matching, but it was a very large trial in Florida by Radster. They did 280 patients. And what they found was a statistically significant reduction in mortality from 25% down to 50%. Again, remember, 25% is right around what we see in hospital mortality. Now they got theirs down to 15%. Severe illness mortality was more than half. So if you had severe illness and you didn't get ivermectin, 80% died, whereas 38% died if you got ivermectin. So really dramatic, large magnitude clinical effects of ivermectin in hospitalized patients. Similarly, Kahn also did an observation control trial, also large, 248, and they also showed a dramatic reduction in mortality and length of stay. Goria in Iraq, they showed a significant decrease in the length of stay. It was halved. That's huge. There's not a lot of mortality in a small trial, but no one died if you got ivermectin. Again, it's a very small group, so you can't say anything. The only negative trial in my whole talk is this Soto-Becerra paper, which is a very strange trial. I talk about it more in my manuscript, but it looks at this database of many hundreds of patients who got different cocktails of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, and they just couldn't find a signal of ivermectin. They didn't see any benefit to ivermectin, but there's something wrong with the paper in that when they constructed the comparison groups, all of the treatment groups had lots of deaths on day 2, whereas the control groups had no deaths, no early deaths. And so to find a lack of benefit in this weird comparison group, again, I don't want to dismiss all negative data as being weak, but this study really had problems that I could not figure out. And so I don't know why, but there is a negative trial, although the methods and their findings are really hard to follow. Hashim just posted a paper on a preprint server, again, showing dramatic reduction in mortality, which approached statistical significance, 0.052. And then in Brazil, again, another just huge reduction. This is a large trial. It had 1,400 patients in it. 700 were treated with ivermectin. And if you got ivermectin, your overall mortality in the hospital was 1.4%, which is extremely low. And so we're seeing these consistent, reproducible, large, randomized, and large observation control trials showing that it works prophylactically, early outpatient, and even in late phase hospital disease. So let me just click through there. Paul Marik, he put the data together of these trials into a meta-analysis, and it shows that both observational and randomized are aligning on the same side in favor of ivermectin. And so as of right now, the existing available clinical evidence is really showing that this is an effective treatment. And we needed one, guys. We needed one. Too many therapies have failed. We've tried too many things that had some theoretic or biologic rationale, and they just haven't panned out in that leap from the bench to the bedside. But ivermectin looks like it's making that leap. So if it's working so well, why isn't everyone using it? So that I don't really know how to answer it. I did this slide this morning. I tried to come up with an answer, but this is my sense of the world right now. So number one, everybody's waiting for something like the recovery trial, right? Which is a 6,000 person randomized controlled trial conducted by Oxford and dumped on the world, and everybody listened, right? So unless you get this huge randomized controlled trial to turn everyone's heads, there's so much noise right now. Everybody's claiming this, that, the other thing. Even with hydroxychloroquine, for every study that showed it doesn't work, there's a study that shows it works. And so everybody's confused on how to interpret the evidence. But I'm trying to tell people, and that's what I want to talk about in this talk, is that the data for ivermectin is lining up in truly remarkable ways. And so the only problem with the ivermectin data is what I say right here, is that it's early. We're onto this because we're seeing the signals line up, but they haven't been peer reviewed. Some of them are just data that are available on clinicaltrials.gov. And so I don't think it's official yet. So I don't know that it's going to influence public policy yet until that data gets validated, peer reviewed, and published. The other thing is, which I just talked about, is that so many failed therapies have gone on that, like, everybody I think is just lumping ivermectin in with all the other failed ones. But I think ivermectin has been what we call the sleeper hit. It's been there and it's been working, and we just haven't seen it. And that's where this story gets really crazy, because the truth is many people have been using ivermectin, and widely. We now have epidemiologic data to support its efficacy against this pandemic. And so what's happened is there's been a lot of countries, cities, and regions of the world where ivermectin distribution campaigns were conducted by health ministries. In every single circumstance, it was against the national health ministry. Hey, Puya, tell me how much time I have left. I have like maybe 5 more minutes.
Yeah, 5-10 minutes, no problem at all.
It's okay. I just want to make sure I'm not going too long. But we're coming to the end. So this is where the story, to me, gets just fascinating and overwhelming. So let's look at what happened in Peru. So let's talk about the story of what happened in Peru. So that paper that I presented earlier from Kaylee et al. From Australia, where they showed this dramatic benefit of ivermectin in the lab against the viral replication. Well, the scientists and the federal doctors in Peru, they looked at that. They saw these incredible mortality, morbidity rates, and they said, you know what? It seems that there's rationale for use as an antiviral agent. And they actually made a national recommendation to use ivermectin back in May. It's no longer true. The Peruvian government no longer recommends ivermectin because of the lack of recovery trial type data, okay? And so I think everybody's confused. But at the time, they wanted to throw something at this oncoming onslaught, right? And so they threw ivermectin. And so what happened is, in many regions of Peru, the regional health ministries started ivermectin distribution campaigns. And this one data analyst, and I don't know why he's alone, nearly alone in the world, but he's a data analyst named Juan Chimie. He's from Colombia, and he started hearing about efficacy of ivermectin, and he started hearing about more widespread uses of ivermectin, and he started following the data. And he put a paper up, which is nothing short of, I don't know, I think it's a historic landmark paper from a data analyst who's not a doctor. He just knows how to navigate databases and compile data. And he did 2 critical things. And I think what he did was absolutely miraculous. So he looked at the timing of the distribution in these regions, and he had a really good sense of when ivermectin started to roll out and started to be used more and more widely. And then he just simply, looked at that and compared it to what was happening with the case fatality rates and the case counts. And let me show you some of this data. So here he is. He looks at 8 different regions in Peru, which started pumping ivermectin out. And so if you look, there's a shaded part of these on the left side of each graph. The shaded part is before ivermectin, and then the white part is after ivermectin. And if you look at these are the total deaths and case incidents. So in blue are the cases, in red, here the red line is the deaths. And so let's look at Laredo. The cases start to spike. The early deaths are massive. Ivermectin gets distributed, the deaths go down, and they remain extremely low, almost approaching or at pre-pandemic levels. Pre-pandemic levels. Same thing in each subsequent region. You see the same association, temporal association with ivermectin use and reduction in case counts and case fatalities. He even showed this, and this is, by the way, this is only in patients over 60. So I need to emphasize that. All of the data you're looking at is in the subgroup of patients who are over 60 years old. So this is not confounded by increases in cases of young people. We're not even looking at young people on this slide. This is only patients over 60. Suddenly, patients over 60 are dying in extremely high rates, and now they're not. Something must be changing. Either they got 40 years younger or something else is at play. And he shows that again here in the case fatality rates. So the case fatality rates before, again, see the shaded parts before ivermectin is being used, were 40 to 50% in some areas. 40 to 50%. Same area here, 6% case fatality rate in patients over 60. We know that for every year you get older with COVID, your mortality goes up. The graphs showing mortality and age are nearly linear. They are linear. Every decade older that you are, your risk of dying is higher and higher and higher. But here, they're showing the opposite. In these older patients, they're showing drastic reductions in case fatality rates. This graph, Juan Chimia just shared with me yesterday, and this is a really interesting graph. So first of all, there's a lot going on, but if you look at the blue graphs, right, those were all the regions with their ivermectin distribution before and after their peak death days, right? And if you look, the red that's in the background, that was in Lima. And guess what happened in Lima? They did not distribute ivermectin to the population. And when you see those dramatic numbers of deaths that are not decreasing, of late they have, but during all that ivermectin distribution in the other areas where you see these plummeting case counts, you don't see the same thing in Lima. And the case fatality on the right side of the screen, the C, that's important because that's a ratio, right? So the case fatality rate, where you're seeing that very few people are dying once you get it in those other regions, whereas in Lima, you're still having like a 40% case fatality rate where you're under 10 in almost all those regions with widespread ivermectin use. I find this to be extremely, extremely compelling data. And to me, it shows that there might be an end in sight, but we got to get the word out, and that's why we're here. So that was Chimia's data that he did in Peru. And he also has lots of other analyses that he's done from Paraguay and other regions. I didn't have the time to include all of his unbelievable, excellent work. But I wanted to use a different source. So there's a man named Alan Cannell in Brazil. He's a British engineer, lives in Brazil. And he kind of did the same thing. He heard of these big cities in Brazil that, in the midst of the pandemic, they started ivermectin distribution campaigns. And I don't know that I'll pronounce it well, but this Itajai, this city in Brazil, which is in the south, they started pumping out ivermectin. And compared to a neighboring city, similar size, the percent of case counts, although they did decrease, they doubled their decreases if you were pumping out ivermectin. Similar difference in Macapa, and then Natal, which actually distributed something like 1 million doses. Their case rates compared to June and July after their distribution was 19% of what they had, compared to the neighboring city, which had decreased, but not nearly as much. Again, this is populational epidemiologic data suggesting that ivermectin is having population-wide effects. A similar thing that he did the same thing. He looked at deaths. So the last slide was case counts. Here in deaths, he saw a reduction in deaths in Santa Catarina, where they started using ivermectin, 36% reduction in deaths compared to almost no reduction in other neighboring cities in the same region. And that plays out across all three cities. So Amapa, where the other city was, Macapa is, that they also showed this dramatic reduction in deaths when ivermectin is being used. And so if you even look, so in Rio Grande del Norte, in Ceará, they had an increase in deaths where they had a corresponding decrease in deaths. And so, again, really compelling, reproducible data showing that ivermectin is working. So before I finish with our final slide on our protocol, I just really want to call out the work that's been done, because all of those clinical trials and trialists that have been posting their data, doing those trials, that's hugely important. That was the stuff I reviewed. But I really think for me, what really moved me and just made me sort of obsessed with this topic is the work of Juan Chimier and Alan Cannell. And both of their work actually were only highlighted in one place, and it was on Trial Site News, which is this fascinating website. It's a compendium of all results from all trials and research being done, especially in the pandemic. And it's this amazing resource where I get a lot of real-time, up-to-date data that's coming out on the therapeutics in COVID-19. And I thought they were really helpful. In fact, that's how I found the work of Chimier and Cannell. And then obviously I'm going to put a shout out to Paul Marik, because he saw that signal, he saw it starting to line up, he started talking to us about it, and the rest of us got obsessed, and we started really looking at ivermectin, and we found all this data, and now we're trying to put forth an argument, and in consequence to that, this is my last slide, we now came up with a new protocol. So the group, although we only had a hospital protocol before, it was Paul who had his own pre-hospital protocol. Now the group, now that we have evidence showing that there is something that we can treat early as both a prophylaxis and early treatment agent, we've now come up with what we're calling an eye mask protocol, where I want to emphasize still the behavioral interventions that you need to do, right? The mask, and Puya, you and I have talked about masks a lot. So you still need to do all the good stuff. But now we have something that is even more helpful. And so we're recommending ivermectin, certainly on the right side of the screen in early treatment. And we have if you go to our website, we have dosing table, recommended dosing regimens and tables. So in early treatment, you really want to take your ivermectin straight off. That's number one. The second thing is, and by the way, these dosing and frequency is not up to date. I'm just recognizing now I used an older version. So I really want to make sure that everyone visits the website for the most up-to-date dosing. It's www.flccc.net. But for prophylaxis for high-risk individuals, and who's high risk? Well, I think that's a determination that the doctor has to make. But we think, based on those trials, if you were to take it once a week, it would drastically reduce your chances of getting COVID. In fact, if you look at the population data, if everyone did that, or a lot of people did that, it seems like transmission rates and deaths would plummet. Now, the one question that I'm going to leave us with, and I just talked with Dr. Marik about this morning, is it safe? We know it's extremely safe drug, but we also know that people who take this drug, they take one dose. So is it safe to take it every week for prolonged periods? We have no data on that. We don't know what that dose is that you should take. And we're actually in discussions right now on what we're really recommending if people decide to prophylax. So you have to understand, we don't know the safety of chronic usage. Our guess is that it's probably safe, and on a risk-benefit ratio or analysis, it's probably safer than getting COVID. However, we have to be very careful because we don't have data, because there's no model for that. No one has prophylaxed with ivermectin before. And so there is a concern around that. I will say that the Argentinian study, they took drops of 0.2 milligrams 5 times a day. So they took a milligram a day for 28 days. So that's about 7 milligrams a week. And nobody got COVID in that trial. So it suggests that at least for a month, it's safe. The adverse effects were not different. And it also suggests that around 7 milligrams a week was safe. So, the pills come in 3 and 6 milligram tablets. So maybe the right dose is 6 milligrams a week. Remember, the right dose of any medicine is the lowest dose to control symptoms or disease. And so we may change our recommended dosing strategy as we go, as we learn more. So I just want to put out that word of caution that that's a subject under discussion. But this is our protocol for prophylaxis and early treatment of COVID, which we think is going to be profoundly effective. And with that, Dr. Dehgani, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Pierre, for the beautiful review and the up-to-date experience in science with this. And very plenty of questions around. Some of them has been asked early, so you already replied to them, some of the other not. first one that I would like to go with is that there are so many proposals for interactions and prophylaxis around. Why would you suggest a use of such drugs if you don't have results in the prolonged usage?
So it sounds, that sounds like a question of that I was just trying to answer, right? Which is we don't have data on prolonged use, and so why are we recommending prolonged use? We have data that it's effective as a prophylactic. So if you have someone in your household who has COVID, and that's what we call post-exposure prophylaxis, taking 2 doses, 72 hours apart, seems to drastically reduce. So I'm going to say we're very comfortable with suggesting post-exposure. So anyone you know who's sick that you spent time with who got COVID, probably a good idea to take post-exposure prophylaxis. Chronic prophylaxis, to protect yourself from ivermectin, we don't have the data of safety. We have the data suggesting efficacy for at least a month. We just don't have the data on safety. So if you're asking me why we're recommending, I don't know that we're recommending it. I think we're suggesting it. And I'm also being very careful here, saying that it's a recommendation that's based on not enough safety data. But if I'm an ICU doctor, I'm seeing so many patients dying of COVID. My clinical sensibility, remember, as doctors, our risk benefit tolerance varies greatly. As an ICU doctor, I probably have a more, liberal or conservative risk benefit analysis. And my understanding of COVID is the benefit of taking ivermectin is likely much more helpful than getting COVID, than the risks of taking it. And so that's just one man's opinion, and that's our group's opinion, but it's not based on tons of data.
Yeah. So let's go back to the questions. The other one is, this is a great talk, and it is very interesting. Thank you so much. I work as a senior registrar in otolaryngology in one of the largest tertiary healthcare centers in central India, and I would like to point out and agree to this. Other than the microbiome theory offering relative immunity in countries like India, antivirals cannot really be used on a large scale due to the cost involved. Ivermectin has been used at almost every single government hospital with phenomenal results as a prophylaxis and also treatment. We know these healthcare workers who took ivermectin as a prophylaxis has held milder disease. This is one of our colleagues, and in fact, this is one thing that I would like to raise.
He or she knows this. Somebody knows this. Nobody's listening. I don't understand how, with all that experience, we can't get the word out. My belief is this talk, Puya, hopefully is going to change that trajectory, because this really used clinical trials. It's not anecdotal. It's not a doctor saying, I see it work. I mean, we're actually seeing studies where they're measuring the effects. And so hopefully it'll bring more serious attention. But I don't want to interrupt. But yes, I appreciate what that person wrote.
Yeah. And then of course, there's some questions in regard to Peru. And our colleagues is saying, don't in Peru uses lockdown? I don't know how to define this. I don't know if Peru's uses lockdown. I don't know it.
So there's definitely been multiple interventions going on at the same time. So everybody has used, and I am not an expert on the extent, the timing, or the duration of the lockdowns in Peru. But what I do appreciate is that in Chimia's work, there's a reproducible temporal association with ivermectin distribution, which he did not find with lockdowns or other interventions. In fact, he found them during and after lockdowns. And so, and that played out in Brazil and Peru. It also played out in Paraguay. I mean, Chimia has multiple examples of this. I only showed 2 of his best work. But I don't see that kind of association. Now, the other thing about lockdown, right? Lockdown will decrease your case count, but how will it decrease your case fatality rate?
Yeah.
Right? So if it was the effect of a lockdown, I could see that explains the case count decreases. It does not explain the drastic reductions in patients dying once they get COVID. That's my answer.
Yeah. Another question is, what are the most important side effects?
The most common are really mild. They're like, and like I said, they're what we know of them is from when it's being used in the treatment of parasitic infections. These are patients who are infested with parasites, largely helminths, which are worms, right? And so when they take ivermectin, there's sometimes a rash, a fever, a headache. Itchiness is often common. That's also thought due to the parasites. But they're really, that's it. Listen, 3.7 billion doses of ivermectin have been distributed in the world since it started being used in users. 3.7 billion doses. If there was a signal of danger,
can I ask you this? We have a huge problem in Italy because we have the animals. There seems like almost quite kryptonite to find out ivermectin. The people are just worried and going to try to find this. Is there any essential benefits, or there's some unhealthy thing if they are using animal use for ivermectin, or do we need only human doses or human based drugs as ivermectin?
yeah, if I understood the question, Puya, is that so the dosing is the same as far as I understand. I'm not a veterinarian, but as in my reading, the dosing is the same for humans and animals, which is it's 200 micrograms or 0.2 milligrams per kilogram. So for horses, it's the same when they have parasites, and so the dosing is the same. Obviously, in a lot of the animals, they don't take tablets, so that comes in different pastes and whatnot. But ivermectin is ivermectin. I am not recommending that people use animal formulations of the product because they haven't been tested in humans. But at the same time, I don't know of evidence of harm. But I can't recommend that they do that. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure if I did. Did I?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. So doses are quite the same because it's go pro kilograms. So it's
Yep.
quite the same. We don't know actually if there are differences in the animal use or human use. It might be similar, but we still don't know. Of course, if somebody has to take it, we will go to suggestion for a human use, not an animal use.
Of
But
course.
we will see. I think that this talk today is going to be the first, or of course, this is not the first one, but it's going to put forward science and might be for some interest in future studies. This is what we should do in the future to get some results. If we don't move, we don't get results. So it's a step,
I
and this is
agree.
important. And
And
this step has been made after people already have provided some data in this. So why just try to say we don't want to hear this? It's we had a hydroxychloroquine, they use it, and now we have some results. We cannot say ivermectin, don't do it just because we don't want to. This is not a political issue. This is a science. We have to go and to.
we want more data. We definitely want more data. I want all the data I can do. I mean, I go onto trial site news every day trying to find new data to support what I think is a really compelling argument. Dr. Marik, this talk today, Dr. Marik put his own lecture on ivermectin maybe a couple of weeks ago. He was the first, and we love Paul. He's the smartest doctor I know. I learned so much from him. We try to catch up to him. We never can. But we try. But he was ahead of this on ivermectin. But since he gave his talk, it was really the epidemiologic data from those sites and those folks that are looking at this that really now seem to be like another piece of the puzzle. So what I hope happens now, Puya, is that everybody recognizes that ivermectin needs to be paid attention to. It can't be dismissed like the rest. In fact, my regret is that we fell in love with hydroxychloroquine. If we had fallen in love, you know what I'm saying? Like everybody thought that was the answer. If we had fallen in love with ivermectin, we would be in a completely different place in history right now.
I think that another important issue or an important talk should be made on the correct use. the majority of the studies that has been carried on hydroxychloroquine was actually based in the improper time of
Yes. Yes.
use.
Yes.
I would love if we can start out and thinking about a prescription in the proper, time, like antiviral, like plasma, like steroids. That's critical. We
Puya.
have to think about time.
So look at this slide, and this
No.
is, it's what I really am so saddened by, and I don't want to do the same as everybody else, is that everyone, especially if you're like paying attention and you're an experienced doctor and clinician, we have been bashing our healthcare authorities and societies for failing to deal properly with this pandemic. And so I don't want to be another one who's just taking shots at everyone like I could do anything better. I think I could do better, but that point you just broke up is look at this slide, right? There are phases to this disease. Paul Marik is starting to describe phases very early on. We understood that what it was early and what it was late was very different. And what was happening was, one is a viral replicative phase, and later on it's a host response inflammatory phase. To test antivirals during a host inflammatory phase in the hospital, like remdesivir, why would you do that? Hydroxychloroquine, why would you use an antiviral 10 days into symptoms? And especially remdesivir, which is a $3,000 a dose drug or something crazy. I mean, the ways in which they designed these trials made no sense on the surface. Now, granted, remdesivir is an IV drug, so it's pretty hard to do as an outpatient. But what was crazy in the U.S., they restricted hydroxychloroquine to the hospital, meaning you couldn't use it as an outpatient. And I was sitting at home, literally pulling my hair out. I don't have a lot of hair, as you can tell, but I was pulling it out. Why would they restrict an antiviral to the late phase hospital disease? And that's why you see, Paul very nicely broke this up into prophylaxis, symptomatic, and pulmonary. And that's why a lot of these things are negative, is because they're using the drugs at weird times, at times where there's no biologic rationale for using them. Sorry, that's a little bit of my soapbox, as we call it. So you triggered me there, Puya. Sorry.
I know. Well, in regards to the cost effective Asia, which was the colleagues from the otolaryngology. Based on this, Asia is one of my collaborators. She's a great scientist in this, and she also said, also as far as side effects are concerned, we have noticed no major side effects, and also it's one of the cheapest drugs available here. And this is the question: why everyone is just avoiding or trying to escape from costs? This is a pandemic. Pandemic means everywhere, and we know there are places where the cost of living and the incomes are not affordable for using antiviral. So antiviral, of course, they would have some benefits in the right time, but we have to make sure to use things that could be accessible for everyone. And it seems that the places where the incoming or the salary are less, India, some places around, they do have lesser mortality and infection. Could be something related to the usage of cheap drugs and stuff like this. We don't know, but we will see. We'll see.
I think it's the ivermectin, but here's the thing: is that I don't want to get too grandiose or over dramatic, but the paper that I just put up on the preprint server, one of the titles that I was bandying around was, I wanted to call ivermectin a potential global solution. And the reason why is, if you were to just sit down right now and do a mental exercise of thinking about, what do we need to get out of this hellhole? What do we need? Your answer would be, we need a cheap, safe, widely available drug that is effective in preventing transmission, early treatment, and hospital, that people could take ubiquitously. That could be available to the poor, the rich, the isolated, the rural, the cities. It's easily compounded. You're talking about some of the poorest countries in the world are pumping this out. So in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, which is a state of 210 million people, that regional health ministry has now been providing ivermectin for early treatment in all of the households. Now, they went against the national health ministry in doing that, but they do have a campaign. So if a relatively poor country, and many of those areas are poor, they can afford to put out ivermectin to all of the population. That sounds like a potential global solution if it works. And it looks like it does.
So I'm sorry, Pierre, we don't have much time. It's time,
Sure.
just time for one question. If you would like to answer this, of course, it's not related to ivermectin, but since I think that it's going to be related with eye mask. So focusing on the vitamin C in outpatient, 2,000 milligram per hour, 2-3 times a day, isn't it a risk to causing diarrhea? Isn't it better 500 milligram for 6 hours?
So I have not been aware of diarrhea with vitamin C. So those doses are once you're actively ill. So we know that once you become actively sick, your consumption of vitamin C and your levels drastically decrease. The pharmacokinetics of vitamin C are that if you want to try to maintain either normal or supranormal levels, which is my particular interest, and that's how I actually first became close colleagues with Dr. Marik, is I got extremely interested in the potency of intravenous vitamin C. And it seems to be that that is a drug that actually works the better at supraphysiologic levels. And that's why we're saying once you're sick, you should take those kind of doses frequently. And because it's rapidly excreted. So you really need to take it frequently. So is it better to take 500 2 to 3 times? I mean, so many people take such high doses and it's only acute during the illness. I don't know that it's better. I don't know that it's worse. I don't know that we have data, but your absorption kinetics of vitamin C in the intestine is limited. So you really want to make sure that you saturate those kinetics. And so I don't know, if I was sick, I don't want to shoot for the lower side of vitamin C. I would rather shoot for the higher side, unless, of course, it's not tolerated. I don't know about the association with diarrhea.
Exactly. The first studies were based on vitamin ascorbic acid were made in, if I'm not wrong, in for the COVID-19, were in China, where they used intravenously,
Yeah.
not orally, which is different, high doses, and those doses that are also prescribed in the, suggested in the Math Plus also, which is a little bit different. There are steps, as you said. We are talking about outpatients. We're talking about patients that has been effective and their cells are being affected by the viruses. So the virus is inside the cells. So the consumption is increased. So that's not the problem with an increased dose of vitamin C. So I'm very sorry that we have to end it up. I think that we would have like 300,000 different questions. But if would love to have questions, please, please, please just focus the attention in the website www.flccc.net. You will see majority of the studies and the update, because the Math Plus protocol has been updated frequently, and I think that IMAS would be either in regard to this one thing that I would stress. It's one thing. Please, 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 Pierre, I think I would love if you could support me in this. For everyone that has been affected, please, oximeter is essential.
Yes.
Because it's critical.
I'm a lung doctor, Puya. I'm a lung doctor. I support you. I saw that in your Protocollo D, and I think that's really important. No, it's true. I mean, in this disease, a shortness of breath is sometimes not sent. People can have lung disease and not know it. So an oximeter is really helpful. And this is what I want to say to support you. As an ICU doctor, as a doctor who's seen these patients in the hospital, the later they arrive and the more advanced disease they have, the harder it is to turn them around. When they come late and their lungs are already inflamed and the x-rays are abnormal and they're on lots of oxygen, it's extremely hard to treat them. early presentation is better. And so your recommendation to check oximetry is excellent. It's excellent. If your numbers are starting to go down and you're having a symptom, please see a doctor.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Pierre. I would love to have you in the next few weeks, if you're available, for an update for everything. We will have a scheduling days every 2 weeks to have an update and see where we are in the future. And I really hope and believe that everything will brought the light and we will see some news in regards.
Have me back. This is the solution. You know, we got to get this. We got to get the train moving here. People have to understand that this is, I mean, by all the evidence that I presented, it looks like it's the solution. And so we need to validate that and get everyone to understand that.
I know. So just for concluding, for let you know, the Italian system is basing everything, of course, in science and evidence-based medicine. And now we are at the point that the only prescription for outpatients is paracetamol. So that means you were left alone, you take that, without also telling the people in regard to the glutathione problem and the stuff like this. So we're just leaving the people around without saying anything in regards to the fact that cells could be damaged, reactive oxygen species. We should focus on the outpatients because those are the patients, especially those in high risk. We have to monitor them.
Of course. Now we have something that we can do. And you know, my worry is that everybody's going to wait for the. Everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say the recovery.
I know
trial. You know, they're going to wait for these. The randomized control trial, and I really hope that we have enough data now to not have to wait for those trials. We can treat patients based on this evidence. In my opinion, the best available evidence today suggests that ivermectin is a solution.
Thank you. Pierre, thanks everyone for tuning in. If you have any questions, check in FLCCC. You can also contact directly Pierre. I think that you can find easily some email for him. So I see you in 2 weeks and we will talk about it in the next few days. Me and you will stick together and we will find another things. Thank you so much.
We're in this together. Thank you for having me.